Hello, and welcome to our discipleship series of videos. Today we're going to be discussing choosing a translation that fits you. Maybe you've gone to a Bible study or to a church sitting and you opened up to the passage that was being studied that day, and the person starts to read and you're trying to follow along only to find out that your version of the Bible doesn't quite read the same way as theirs. That is the problem of translation. Translation happens because the Bible was originally written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And for the most part, most of us do not read Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, or even speak it. And these languages that they were written in are called dead languages, which means they're no longer changing. The Hebrew and the Greek that is spoken in modern times is not the same thing. English is a living language, and languages usually are living and they're changing and they're constantly making new ideas and new idioms and new ways of saying things. For instance, we can look at the word cool. Cool before the 1980s meant something was cold. But around the 1980s, it changed and people began to use it for something that was cool or awesome or good. And so if I saw something I really liked, I might say, cool. Now, I remember my grandmother, when I was about 5 years old, looking at me and getting mad at me for saying that because that's not how that language is used. But languages change. And with that change, we have to understand the new meaning behind the way we are using words. Because the Bible is a dead language, we have to understand the concept of words as they are used throughout the history of that language, because languages don't just suddenly die. It takes time for that to happen, and the changes are usually subtle. And so when translators get down and they start looking at the Hebrew and the Greek, they try to decide, what does it mean in this context? What does it mean in this time period? Is it a new word? Some of the words in the Bible are brand new in history when they are written. And so they have to figure out, what was the author trying to say? And there's lots of different ideas because there's lots of different options. Just like cool can have multiple meanings in different settings, so can a lot of the words that are found in the Bible. In addition to the problem of the changing of words, is that languages don't always translate word for word. In fact, there's a lot of things, a lot of idioms or sayings that we have in English that if we tried to translate into a different language, such as Mandarin Chinese, it wouldn't quite work the same way. They would look at us like we were kind of funny. And we see this, maybe we go to a Chinese restaurant, we're looking at the menu, and we see a weird way of how they are wording something. And it's because they've translated it from Chinese to English, and it just doesn't work the same. And so we have to understand that sometimes in the Bible, they are translating an idiom or a saying that made sense in the Greek, but if we translated it word for word in the English, it would not have the same context. And so that's what makes up a lot of the variety in our versions. There are a lot of different versions out there. The most famous English version is the King James Version. It was written in 1611. And because it was written in 1611, there's a lot of archaic form of words. And so my encouragement always is to find a newer translation, because it's going to make more sense to us. If you like the King James, they have an updated version that came out in 1970s, and that was the New King James. But there's a lot of other options out there as well. Translations often fall into three broad categories. They are the functional equivalent, the formal equivalent, and the paraphrase. The formal equivalents are translations that try to translate it as best they can, word for word. The problem with these translations is that they oftentimes are very wordy. In the handouts for this lesson, we've given an example from John chapter 3, verses 19 through 21 of different translations that fall into these categories. And if you look at the formal equivalent, you can just read it and see, wow, I got to almost translate that back into modern English. And so there's some problems with it. The functional equivalents, instead of translating word for word, they try to translate ideas for ideas. It works out really well when you're trying to read particularly a passage of Scripture that is very difficult to understand in the formal equivalent. The problem is a lot of functional equivalent requires the translators to interpret the Bible. And so sometimes, depending on who is translating, you might see some theological leaning that maybe you don't necessarily agree with. And so you have to be aware of that. Paraphrases do exactly what they say they do. They paraphrase. And rather than going back to the original language, many of the paraphrases simply look at an English version of the Bible and then they paraphrase what has been said. These are especially helpful when you're really stuck on a passage and you're just not getting what the author meant. And so turning to a paraphrase might help you understand by giving it a different wording, a different light. So all three types of translations have their purposes. And so when you're trying to choose a translation for yourself, you have to decide, what are you trying to get out of the Bible? Are you trying to read it and study what the original authors meant? If so, then a formal equivalent might work best for you. If you're just kind of skimming it and you just want to understand the ideas that are spoken, then a functional equivalent would be very helpful. Paraphrases, I don't usually encourage people to study the Bible from them. They're more there when you get to a passage that you just cannot get out of the other two. You can turn to a paraphrase to help you. In the end, it really doesn't matter. Whatever translation you choose that works best for you, it probably is a good translation. It's not usually one person translating. It's usually a team of scholars who've dedicated their lives to this. And so no matter what translation, those scholars have spent hours trying to get it just right. Just recognize that what you choose may not be what someone else chooses. And so you have to kind of interpret that as you are reading a passage together. In the handouts, we give some suggestions on the various categories of translations. We hope that it will be helpful as you're seeking to find a translation that fits best for you.